All right, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Cynthia Riccio, and I am the Director of Programs and Planning for the New Haven Museum. Thank you for your patience today while we got some of our technology straightened out. And welcome to the second in the New Haven Museum webinar series, Voices of Legacy, Lunchtime Conversations on Early Black Women. Today, Joan Duffy will share the inspirational life story of Mary Ann Goodman, a free woman of African descent whose bequest to create a fund for seminarians of color made history. During her webinar, Duffy will demonstrate how Goodman's 1872 endowment of her entire estate, $5,000, made her the first woman of color to establish a scholarship at Yale University. Goodman's bequest to Yale Divinity School at a time when students of color were denied formal matriculation into the university was extraordinary, says Duffy. The gift changed the face of the school with the admission of Solomon Melvin Coles. From that point forward, Duffy says the Divinity School's African-American presence has continued to grow and thrive. Joan Duffy is a senior archives assistant at the Yale Divinity Library Special Collections. Her work is equal parts public and technical services. One of the most extraordinary aspects of her job is meeting scholars and students from all over the globe and helping them with their research. She was born and continues to reside in the greater New Haven area, is especially interested in local history and telling the stories of historically excluded individuals in the New Haven community. Welcome, Joan.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Cindy, for inviting me to present the program today. I'm honored to have this opportunity to share the most unusual and very inspirational story from 19th century New Haven. Previous research and writing on Mary Ann Goodman was done by Yale's chief research archivist and former New Haven historian Judith Ann Schiff, who sadly passed away in 2002. The work I present here came about in response to many inquiries received through the years for more information. This is a continuation of Judy's work, and therefore I dedicate this to her memory. While already engaged in my research, I was further inspired by a short documentary produced by Tobias Cropper of the Beinecke Library. It is entitled What Could Have Been America's First HBCU, and I highly recommend you watch it on Beinecke's YouTube channel. It is the story about the efforts of a group of free Black citizens, along with some white abolitionists, led by the Reverend Simeon S. Jocelyn, to establish a college for young African Americans in New Haven. Had they been successful, this would have been the first historically Black college in the country. For the story of Mrs. Mary Ann Goodman, the good woman of New Haven, I have dug deeply, archivally, and even archaeologically, and I'm pleased to share this story with you. Who was Mary Ann Goodman? The going narrative before I began my research can be summed up in three basic points. Of African descent, she gave the earnings of her life to educate men of her own color in Yale College for the gospel ministry. A humble washerwoman and widow who attended College Street Congregational Church and was accustomed to good preaching, had not provided a place for her own burial plot uh, in the Yale. So the Yale University gave her a plot in the Yale section of Grove Street Cemetery, since she had given such an extraordinary gift. This sounds like a story of biblical proportions, fashioned after the widow with two mites described in Luke 21, verses 1 through 4. Perhaps 19th century Yale divines could not help themselves to put such a spin on the narrative. In Mrs. Goodman's case, it is too good And also, very true, there is much more than meets the eye, and all in a very good way. So, what inspired Mrs. Goodman's generous gift? The Goodman bequest has been noted as the most unusual gift the university ever received. Why? Well, it was extremely generous for the time. $5,000 in 1872 would equal $129,346.31 in today's market. And I've been giving this talk for a couple of years now and in various settings, and that has increased with the market inflation. So it's at a pretty high amount at this point. It was gifted by a free African American woman from Massachusetts who had no real connection to Yale Divinity School. And it was earmarked to support young men of African descent in their theological studies. Yet the Yale Divinity School of Mrs. Goodman's era did not matriculate students of color. To gain more insight, I sought potential sources of inspiration in her life. I found them in her family, her friends, her faith, and the philanthropy that was prevalent at the time in the New Haven churches, and a preacher who studied for 1 year at Yale Divinity School, Alexander Crummell, had preached in Washington, D.C., that he would like to see the community of African Americans in Washington, D.C., have the same philanthropy that he observed while he was visiting in New Haven and attending and preaching in New Haven churches. So let's look at Mary Ann Goodman's parents. Um, her maiden name was Brewster, and her faith and her family were closely interwoven, and they were important during her formative years. The young Mary Ann was brought up in a church-going family in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Although the Brewsters were enumerated as slaves on the 1820 census, I have it on the authority of the president of the Berkshire Historical Society that all individuals of color at that time were enumerated as slaves. However, since Mr. Brewster owned property and contracted his own construction projects, it does seem quite logical to assume that he was a free man of color. Her mother, Mary Brewster, was listed in the church records of the First Congregational Church of Pittsfield, and that is how I discovered her. She's listed her separately from Charles, her husband, but since his name is listed in parentheses after her between her first and last names, I was able to figure that out. Unfortunately, she passed away on June 24th, 1834, and so Charles and daughter Mary Ann, who was then Mrs. Hopkins, moved to New Haven. While at the First Congregational Church at Pittsfield, the congregation included their neighbors, the Day family, headed by Gad Day, and his sons, George Edward, for whom the one of the rooms in the Yale Divinity Library is named for his philanthropy and gifts of books, and his brother Horace. They were 10 years younger than Miss Mary Ann, and both of the families moved to New Haven in 1838 as the Day brothers began ministerial studies at Yale Divinity School. The Days became members of the First Congregational Church, familiarly called Center Church on the Green, while the Brewsters joined the College Street Congregational Church, and which in 1838 met in a building on Church Street. Mr. Brewster remarried, and he and his new wife Maria subsequently joined the College Street Church, where Marianne and her husband William Hopkins were now attending. Later, they transferred their membership to the Howe Street Congregational Church, where Mr. Brewster worked as a sexton after retiring from shoemaking. The churches of the day were starting to have a bit of a change with the abolitionist sentiment in town, and so the churches that the Brewsters were attending had taken a stance against owning slaves and made it a punishable offense according to their confession of faith and covenant. Marianne Brewster Hopkins' stepmother was Mrs. Maria Young, presumably a widow, and they married on May 18th, 1838. She had been born in Norwalk and was originally a member of Simeon Jocelyn's Temple Street Congregational Church. The couple lived on Martin Street, which is now Edgewood Avenue in New Haven, and she was honored as the oldest person to die in the year 1884 at the age of 97. And if you noticed on the slide for Mr. Brewster, he was also honored at 97 to be one of the oldest people still living, but he lived 3 more years to age 100. Marianne Brewster married twice and was predeceased by both of her husbands. The church records in the Yale Divinity Library show that Mr. and Mrs. Hopkins, William and Marianne, were received as members of the College Street Congregational Church by profession of faith in 1844. The church was located at the site of today's College Street Music Hall. The church covenant asked, among other things, for members to walk in love and charity with each other. It was customary for members to make monthly contributions to causes and organizations supported by the church. The February 1869 contribution was for education for the ministry. In January 1871, one year before Mrs. Goodman's passing, the treasurer's report shows that College Street Church contributed $275 towards furnishing Yale's Divinity Hall. So Mrs. Goodman certainly had Yale Divinity School on her radar. Sadly, Mr. Hopkins became ill with pneumonia and passed away on October 31st, 1847. He stated that his entire estate should go to his wife and that he wished her to be the executor. According to the death list for that month, William Hopkins was buried in the city burying ground, an earlier name for Grove Street Cemetery. However, the cemetery does not have any records to corroborate his burial. The 1850 College Street Church Manual shows that the widow Hopkins was then Mrs. Bradley M. Goodman. Prior to their marriage, he worked as a grocer at 43 Olive Street, which is the current site of Sally's Pizza parking lot. And you will see a photo of that building in the upper right-hand corner, with the church, which is now St. Peter and St. James. He was also a successful entrepreneur in New York City, where he owned property and where the Goodmans lived after their marriage. Mr. Goodman partnered with Thomas Downing in a catering business. Known as the Oyster King, Downing was renowned in New England for his many delicious ways of preparing oysters. Word traveled across the pond to Great Britain, where he sent his oysters to Queen Victoria. His restaurant at 5 Broad Street in Manhattan drew large crowds, while his oyster cellar served double duty as a safe haven on the Underground Railroad. Mrs. Goodman became a widow once again, and much too soon. Mr. Goodman's life ended rather suddenly from natural causes on July 28, 1851. She petitioned the New York court to become the executor and was the sole heir. These are photos of the interior and exterior of the College Street Congregational Church. Simeon Jocelyn and his family attended there after he concluded his ministry at the Temple Street Church until until he relocated with his family to Williamsburg, New York. After the College Street Church closed, Yale bought it as their music school, and then later it became much like it is now, a music hall where they had shows and films and things like that, and it burned to the ground. So the site is the same as the College Street Music Hall today, but the building is different. The Reverend Simeon S. Jocelyn, a white anti-slavery, anti-colonization, equal rights activist, joined the College Street Church after he finished serving as the first minister of the Temple Street African Ecclesiastical Society, now Dixwell Avenue Congregational Church. Reverend Jocelyn's dream was to establish a Black college in New Haven, but his hopes were dashed when it was voted down at a town meeting. Still, his desire to elevate families of color to equal status with white families would not be extinguished. He and his artist brother, with financial assistance from Thomas R. Trowbridge, purchased property in what is now known as the Hill. The village was set up with 9 squares around a central green. The green came to be known as Trowbridge Square, honoring its largest benefactor. The village of Spireworth, later called Mount Pleasant, became the first diverse community in New Haven, with blacks and whites living peacefully side by side. The only restriction was that residents were forbidden from selling or consuming ardent spirits. Mr. and Mrs. Hopkins purchased land from the Jocelyn brothers on Carlisle Street in the village of Spireworth. They lived 1 block from the Reverend Simeon Jocelyn's family. I have not found any evidence that Mrs. Goodman's home on Carlisle Street is still there. There are 2 large, probably multi-family homes on either side of Carlisle Street at the corner of Howard, and across the street, which is not really a corner anymore, seems it's a small complex of apartments or condominiums. I also, up until about a week ago, did not think that Simeon Jocelyn's home still existed, though I had read that it was a very classic style of the time, and so valuable for that reason. But I've continued to look and read about that area, and I discovered that his home was of the Italianate villa style, and it seems that the house at the corner is not the original house. They moved the house that was at the corner just around the corner to the Putnam Street side, and put up another home at the corner, and all they left was the original iron fence. Well, I found a photo of the home that was moved, which is now at 181 Putnam Street. The fence at the corner home is gone, but in its original location, that home did have that iron fence. So, unless someone who knows architecture well can prove me wrong, it's a good possibility that this Italianate villa style home is the very home that the Jocelyn's lived in, and I'm so excited and happy that that is still in existence. So please, if you know anything about it, please let us all know. Mrs. Goodman earned her living washing clothes. She was twice a widow, outliving both her husbands, William Hopkins and Bradley Goodman. She added a provision in her will for $100 per year to help care for her elderly father. Mr. Charles Brewster died on December 27th, 1871, at the age of 100, 1 month before his daughter, thus negating the provision. Yale Divinity School, then located at the site of today's Hopper College, received the full value of her estate, which, after outstanding bills were paid, amounted to $5,000. In 2025, the market value, as I mentioned before, would be $129,346.31. Indeed, it was everything she had, and quite a generous sum for a woman of such means. So, how did she manage to save this amount? Well, she, twice a widow, she inherited most of the money she willed to the divinity school from her husband's, plus a share in her father's house after he passed away. An accounting of her assets, which appear in the papers of the Yale Treasurer's Office, um, shows um, the accounting that I have remade on your screen. So the all of the papers have been digitized. So I want to be sure that this research can be seen by anyone who is interested. So you would want to contact Manuscripts and Archives or Beinecke through Beinecke Library if you are interested in seeing the originals of these papers. The question lingers as to why Mrs. Goodman gave her entire estate to Yale Divinity School. I believe I discovered the answer in an unexpected buried treasure in the treasurer's office papers. Mrs. Goodman's will includes a description of the land on which their home was built at 115 Carlisle Street in the village of Spireworth. It says the property was bounded southerly by Carlisle Street, northerly by land owned by David Van Dyne, westerly by land formerly owned by Nathaniel Jocelyn, and easterly by land formerly owned by the Reverend Dr. James W.C. Pennington, a former slave who desired a degree from Yale Divinity School, but was denied matriculation and only allowed to audit classes from the back, where he was not to be seen or heard. Mrs. Goodman surely heard Reverend Pennington's story, as well as Reverend Simeon Jocelyn's failed attempt to establish a Black college in New Haven, and she felt compassion. She knew that her bequest would ensure that no African American student would be denied a theological education at Yale, nor the degree that comes with it. In September 1872, 8 months after her decease, the inaugural Goodman Scholarship funded the educations of Yale Divinity School's first two official students of African descent. Former slave Solomon Melvin Cole's class of 1875 was the first to complete the 3-year course, and after graduating, he served with the American Missionary Association and ministered in churches in Texas. James William Morris transferred to YDS from Lincoln University in 1873. With credits previously earned at Lincoln, Morris became the first to graduate, though he was the second to matriculate. And he graduated in 1874, while Solomon Coles graduated in 1875. In 2023, Yale Divinity School proudly conferred the master's degrees posthumously upon James W.C. Pennington, who attended full course, divinity course of 3 years from 1834 to 1837, and Alexandra Crummell, who studied here from 1840 to 41. So they are the Divinity School's first and second African American students, though with as they were not considered official students because they could only sit in on classes, and they were denied degrees at that time due to their race. However, Mrs. Goodman's gift ensured a continued Black presence at Yale Divinity School, which grows each year. It has had benefits beyond Yale University, guaranteeing that church pulpits and other non-traditional ministries would have diverse representation and perspectives. And also we have the ability to grant these two gentlemen from so long ago the degrees that they earned and would have received had they had a scholarship at that early time. Mrs. Goodman's story deserves to be told and retold. It isn't just Yale's story, but New Haven's, and should be a source of pride for our African American community and all of us. So thank you very much, especially for hanging in during the technical difficulties. And I welcome your questions and comments both here or later at my email address, which you can see on the screen. Thank you again.
Joan, thank you so much for sharing that information. We do have one comment that somebody made, and she says, "Good job pursuing the Jocelyn House location." So good detective work there.
Thank you. Now I'd like to get out of out of this and get back with you again. Let me see if I can do that. Stopping.
There you are.
Yeah, it worked.
So I do have a question. What do you think is next for discovery about Marianne Goodman, if anything? Like, is there anything that you think is missing from her story that we still need to find?
I would like to know where she was born. I assume it was in Pittsfield. Um, I'd I'd like to I'd like to find um a record of exactly when she married her first husband. Um, she was definitely an only child. That is specified in Mr. Goodman's will, that since she was the only child, that she receives everything from his estate. Um, One question I have is, um, and this didn't come up in the talk this time. Um, I wonder why um, Marianne Goodman's stepmother didn't speak up about her and where she was to be buried, because the papers at Yale say that she had completely forgotten about a place for herself to be buried. And that actually isn't true, because um, in her accounting of everything that she owned, and part that became part of her estate was a, a plot in the new cemetery, not the old cemetery, which would by that point Grove Street would be the old cemetery. The new, I mean, it's still being used today, but it wasn't the newest cemetery. That would have been Evergreen Cemetery, and I found the Brewsters buried there. So they shared the grave site with a member of their church. So there's another couple buried there, Amos and Eliza Jones. They it's a an area where there are 8 graves. So that couple took 2. Mr. Brewster and his second wife took this 2 more. There's a woman from her church, from their church, who has spawned a story of her own, which maybe I will get to tell one day for you all. And so there are 3 more graves. Mrs. Goodman and both of her husbands could have been buried there, but she's all alone in Grove Street, and
Mm.
I feel badly that she's away from her family. Her first husband might be in there, is supposed to be in there. We just don't have a record of where his grave is. But she gets a lot of visitors from all of us who care about her, and so there's something good to be thought of in that. So
Well, I have 2 more questions.
mm,
Did you use the Whitney Library for some of your research?
I did. I was looking. I looked at a lot of records on gravestones, and that was quite interesting. And uh, the the death records they had, and trying to see if I could find if there was anything different um, in the handwritten listings, as opposed to the barber vital statistics that were published. But it's since that time, the handwritten ones are also appearing in the genealogical databases like Family Search and Ancestry. So I was able to find them, but thanks to Emma and
Yes.
and her predecessor as well.
Yeah. And one final question. Are there any books written about this extraordinary philanthropist?
Well, not yet.
I think you have a challenge there.
Well, that would be great. Definitely, I do have the Divinity School has expressed an interest in an article, but
Okay, great.
maybe we can do something a bit more than that. We'll
Mhm.
see.
Well, again, Joan, thank you so much for being here and sharing this extraordinary story. Please join us for our last in the series of our talks on Wednesday, March 5th, to hear Jennifer Coggins talk about early Black women students at Yale. And again, if you have any questions, you can email Joan. And for any other information about our upcoming programs here at the museum, you can visit our website at newhavenmuseum.org. And thank you all again for being here today. Thanks again, Joan.
Thank you.